Neil and I were driving down the highway leading to a small village called Whiteall, tucked away in a remote corner of Michigan. Neil confidently held the wheel, his eyes focused on the road, while I, sitting beside him, was engrossed in an article on my phone. The article narrated a strange and frightening incident that had occurred the previous day in this quiet village. The Miller family gathered for breakfast, as usual, yesterday morning. It was a gray, uneventful day, except for one circumstance. The previous day, they had buried their beloved grandmother. The loss was still fresh in their hearts, and the mood at the table was somber. Everyone slowly chewed their cereal, lost in their own thoughts. Suddenly, as if out of nowhere, a new guest walked into the kitchen and shamelessly sat down next to them, starting to eat. The guest turned out to be the grandmother they had buried the day before. The family was stunned. They stared at her, unable to believe their eyes. But what struck them most were her eyes, empty, lifeless, like two black holes. In shock and horror, they jumped up from the table, screaming, "Zombie!" and scattering in all directions. When the police arrived, the grandmother was nowhere to be found. The skepticism of many locals was shattered by the facts. Surveillance footage confirmed every word of the Millers. At present, no one knows where the grandmother is or who was impersonating her. Perhaps it was a prank played by someone with a twisted sense of humor, or maybe something much darker and more sinister. Finishing reading the article aloud, I shook my head and murmured, "What awaits us this time? I've never dealt with zombies before. It's scary, but also intriguing." I tore my eyes away from the phone and asked Neil, "What do you think it could be?" Neil kept his eyes on the road, his face remaining impassive. "It could be anything," he replied. "From a prank to some kind of virus." These words seemed to hang in the air, penetrating my soul and making me wonder what we should be prepared for. I looked out the window and saw dense forests rushing past, their shadows seeming to reach out to the car, wanting to engulf us. We passed by small villages, each seeming frozen in time. Houses with crooked roofs, abandoned barns, fields overgrown with weeds. All this created the feeling of a dying land, abandoned and forgotten. Occasionally, lone figures walked along the roadside, their faces hidden in shadow, and their eyes full of indifference to what was happening around them. Several hours passed before we reached Whiteall. This town looked like a cutout from the past. The streets were narrow and winding, paved with old cobblestones that had long lost their former smoothness. Houses stood close together, their facades peeling from time and weather. On the main street, the only one with asphalt paving, there were small shops and cafes, their windows adorned with faded signs. We wasted no time and immediately headed to the address where the Miller family lived. The house turned out to be a large old building with a wide porch and peeling paint on the walls. The rickety shutters flapped in the wind, giving the house an even more ominous look. Tall trees surrounded the property, their branches reaching out to the house as if trying to embrace and hide it from prying eyes. We approached the front door and rang the bell. A few seconds later, the door opened and a middle-aged woman appeared before us. She had dark hair tied in a messy bun and deep shadows under her eyes, a testament to sleepless nights. Her face was scared and tired, but hope flickered in her eyes when she saw us. "Good afternoon," I began, showing my credentials. "We're FBI agents." The woman visibly sighed with relief and invited us in. "I'm so glad you've come. Please, come in." We entered the house, feeling the old spirit of the place. We were led to the kitchen where a man sat at the table, his head bowed. This was the head of the family, John Miller, a tall and sturdy man with gray hair and kind but tired eyes. Seeing us, he lifted his head and smiled with clear relief. "Good to see you, agents," said John, rising from his seat and extending his hand. "I'm John Miller." "Nice to meet you, Mr. Miller," I replied, shaking his hand. "We're here to help figure out what happened." We sat at the table and Mrs. Miller served us tea. Taking the cup, I felt the hot drink slightly warm my tense hands. "Tell us more about what happened," Neil requested, looking at both spouses. "It was terrible," said John Miller, his voice trembling from the memories. "You understand when she came. We had just said goodbye to her, and then she appeared." He began to mutter something incoherent, his words jumbled. It was clear that he was deeply shocked by the incident. "Our children are still upstairs, not coming out of their rooms," he added, looking towards the staircase. I tried to calm him down and asked him to tell us everything in order. His wife, Susan, sat next to him and took his hand. She began to speak, trying to remain calm. "As you already know, we buried her the day before. The ceremony went off without a hitch. When she died, the coroner's report didn't reveal anything suspicious. We can't understand why this happened to her. I asked if they had noticed anything strange before her death. "Not really," Susan replied, thinking. "But when she came, in that form, she moved strangely like a puppet. She was unusually pale, although maybe that's because she was dead, and her hair, it had turned white like an albino's. It used to be gray, but not that white, and also, she showed no signs of aggression, just sat with us at the table." John and Susan exchanged glances, their faces reflecting a mix of horror and confusion. "She just sat there," Susan continued, her voice trembling, "and ate her cereal as if nothing had happened. We asked them a few more questions and then requested to see the house where their grandmother had lived. However, they refused to go there. The recent incident had left a deep impression on them. After obtaining the address, we decided to go there ourselves, taking the keys from the owners who didn't mind. The grandmother lived nearby, just a few blocks away. When we arrived at her house, we were met with an old, dilapidated building with peeling paint on the walls. The windows were covered with a thick layer of dust, and the gable was adorned with intricate carvings that, despite their age, retained their eerie beauty. Tall trees stood like guardians around the house, their branches intertwining, creating shadows that amplified the sense of gloom. We approached the door and, inserting the key, cautiously opened it. Inside, the house was shrouded in semi-darkness, emanating a heavy smell of old wood and dust. In the living room stood massive antique furniture sets, covered with a layer of dust. The walls were adorned with photographs in old frames, showing faces of long-gone people. We walked down a narrow corridor that led to the kitchen. Everything was left as if time had stopped. Dishes covered with a thin layer of dust stood on the table, and old books and jars with unknown contents lined the shelves. After exploring the house, we headed to the garden. Behind the house, something strange was revealed. Gigantic plants, enormous tomatoes and eggplants grew in the garden as if from another reality. Neil bent down to examine one of the plants. He plucked a leaf from one of them, and holding it up against the sun, started to scrutinize it. "Nothing suspicious here," he said, but his voice betrayed a slight unease. I also looked around and noticed a small plant with purple veins on its leaves. Its flowers resembled stars and were the same purple color. I had never seen such a plant before, but the world of botany is vast, and anything is possible. We took a few pictures and returned to the house. My head was full of thoughts about the giant tomatoes and where such a mutation could have come from. We would need to ask the locals. While thinking about tomatoes, I suddenly thought of pizza. We should get something to eat, I muttered, looking around as if searching for something that could unravel all these mysteries. We didn't find anything suspicious in the house except for the giant vegetables in the garden. Deciding that we needed to learn more from the locals and find out where the grandmother's body had disappeared to, we headed back to town. Driving through Whitehall, we noticed that the streets were surprisingly empty. The silence and lack of people heightened the atmosphere of mystery and unease. Soon, however, we saw a lone figure of an old man heading somewhere. We stopped beside him, and I rolled down the window. "Excuse me, where are all the townspeople?" I asked. The old man, dressed in a checkered shirt and a straw hat, looked at us with surprise. He spat out a piece of straw and squinted before answering. "Where is everyone? How can you not know? It's harvest festival time. The whole town is gathered at the fair. This year's harvest was truly legendary. Even TV crews have come, can you believe it?" He struck his chest as if to emphasize the importance of the event. It was a big deal. The old man pointed in the direction we needed to go. "Straight down the main street, then turn left and you'll see the fair. Everyone's there." Thanking him, we headed in the indicated direction. I thought that the Harvest Festival could be an excellent opportunity to gather information. If something strange was happening in this town, the residents would surely mention it, especially in the festive atmosphere where conversations flow freely. When we arrived, we were greeted by the sight of a typical village fair. Rows of stalls were filled with a wide variety of goods, from homemade crafts to fresh vegetables and fruits. The air was filled with the scent of fresh pastries and grilled meat, and the voices of vendors hawking their wares echoed all around. As we walked past the stalls, we noticed the giant fruits and vegetables. The stall owners were indeed proud of their produce, and it was clear why. Enormous apples, gigantic pumpkins, and tomatoes. The size of children's heads attracted the attention not only of the locals but also of fair visitors. We started asking people if they had seen anything suspicious, but most replied that they hadn't noticed anything unusual. One woman from whom we bought an apple answered our question about the source of such large vegetables with a smile. "There's no secret, just a miracle this year." Neil wiped the apple with his handkerchief and took a big bite. The apple was so large that he had to make an effort to take a bite. "Really tasty," he said, smiling. We continued our inquiries until we came across a man. He was a typical resident of a remote province, wearing a checkered shirt, denim overalls, and a small cap on his head. He was sitting in a folding chair and selling huge mushrooms. We approached him and asked where he had gathered them. "Of course, in the forest," he replied, and we began asking if he had seen anything suspicious. After our words, his eyes seemed to light up, and spitting, he began to speak. "Yes, I saw something strange recently. As you know, our forest is very large, and a lot of interesting things can be found there, but most of it is fiction. What I saw recently, I really saw with my own eyes. There were albino animals. Yes, albinos sometimes occur in nature, but not in such numbers. Once, an absolutely white squirrel ran in front of me. Then I noticed a white owl, and also completely white wolves. Well, you know, that's not normal. And they had some strange behavior. They didn't seem to fear me. But what was even more unusual was that I saw strange lights." He paused for a moment, then continued. "One day I stayed out late picking mushrooms, and I was just starting to head home when I saw something strange among the trees. As I got closer, I discovered glowing yellow lights. They were swirling, but soon seemed to notice me and began drifting towards me. I was really scared then and ran as fast as I could. Since then, I haven't gone back to that place. We listened attentively, noting these curious facts. Then we asked him where exactly this place was. The man explained in detail how to get there, and we thanked him, continuing to ask questions of other fairgoers. Soon we heard a buzz around us. People began flocking to the square, where a large stage stood, decorated with flowers, and an arch with the inscription Annual Best Farmer Contest. On the stage stood two people, an elderly man and a woman. The man took the microphone and announced, "The Annual Best Farmer Contest is now open. We have carefully examined all the contestants and their produce." After that, the man opened an envelope, pulled out a piece of paper, and solemnly announced, "The winner is Elliot Greed." As soon as he pronounced this name, a terrible woman's scream erupted from the crowd. Other voices joined in, and in an instant, panic and chaos ensued. Neil grabbed my arm, and we started climbing onto the stage. Once on top, we saw that people had scattered, but something strange was happening in one area. Finally, we saw what it was. It was a huge white bear, but not the kind that lives at the North Pole. It was a regular brown bear, but an albino. Its movements were unnatural, and its eyes glowed with emptiness. It was a zombie creature. The bear was furiously attacking people. We saw it tearing and mauling, creating chaos and horror around it. People were screaming and running, trying to escape the bloodthirsty beast. "Neil, that's it!" I shouted, pointing at the bear. "Damn right it is!" Neil replied, grabbing my arm. "We need to stop it!" It was a truly horrifying sight. Blood and human bodies were flying around, creating a terrifying chaos. The white bear, feeling nothing but animal rage, was tearing and rending. The crowd was in a panic. People were screaming and stumbling, trying to save themselves. Mothers were grabbing their children. The elderly were struggling to stay on their feet, and screams and moans of pain were everywhere. I saw someone fall, and the bear rushed towards them while nearby people were trying to crawl away in terror but couldn't move from fear. The air was filled with the smell of blood and fear, mixed with screams and growls. "Run to the car for weapons!" Neil shouted to me, realizing that we were helpless against this monster without arms. I nodded and dashed through the fair, weaving between running people and falling stalls. Navigating through the crowd, I pushed aside fallen baskets of fruits and vegetables. The path was difficult. People were rushing around me, some falling, others standing frozen in shock. Reaching the car, I flung open the door and rushed to the trunk. I pulled out the weapons we had brought for unforeseen circumstances and hurried back. Holding a heavy shotgun, I once again dashed through the fair, this time moving faster and more determinedly. When I returned, the bear was still rampaging, tearing everything in its path. Neil, breathing heavily, stood beside me and took one of the guns. Armed, we ran towards the bear. As we got closer, I started shooting. Neil joined me, and we both aimed at the creature's head, believing that zombies could only be killed by a shot to the brain. But it seemed to be a stereotype. No matter how much we shot, the bear kept moving. Its head was almost severed, but it seemed not to matter. The worst part was that the dead people were starting to come back to life. The number of zombies was growing. Shooting people, even dead ones, was becoming increasingly difficult. But Neil, without hesitation, shot an approaching zombie, blowing its head off. It kept moving as if nothing had happened. They were gradually surrounding us. I thought it was the end for us. These zombies moved surprisingly fast, not like the slow creatures we were used to seeing in movies. These beings were quite agile. As they closed in, suddenly Neil pulled something shiny from his pocket and threw it to the ground. It flashed brightly, blinding everyone around. All the zombies froze. Neil grabbed me by the clothes and dragged me, shouting, "We need to run!" I didn't hesitate and ran after him. The people around had already scattered, leaving us alone. We reached the car, jumped in, and sped away. I noticed that Neil's shirt was covered in blood. He was injured, but he didn't show it and drove the car with a calmness that could surprise anyone. "You're hurt," I said, looking at him with concern. "It's just a scratch." He brushed it off, keeping the car on the road. "The important thing is we got out of there." We immediately called for backup and reported that the code was red. This meant that cleaners were supposed to arrive in the town. Stopping by the roadside, we started bandaging Neil's wound. The wound was shallow, but clearly from a bite. I looked at him worriedly, fearing he might turn into a zombie soon, but there were no signs of it yet. I remembered that those people turned almost immediately. Pointing this out to Neil, I asked, "Why aren't you turning?" He pondered and said, "Maybe the infection spreads differently." I began to think about how it might work. Perhaps this creature couldn't infect living people, and for a person to turn into a zombie, they had to die first. The infection could happen from a bite, or maybe people were already infected before. Then I remembered how Neil took a big bite of the apple. Could it be that the giant fruits and vegetables were infected? This meant that Neil couldn't die, though he couldn't die anyway. "What are you thinking?" Neil asked, noticing my thoughtful look. "I think the infection might be coming from those giant fruits and vegetables," I replied. "You ate an apple. If it was infected, we need to be very careful." We discussed the situation and concluded that everything started in the forest. We decided to head there to figure out what was going on. We reached the forest, feeling the tension mounting with each passing mile. The dark trees, like silent sentinels, lined the road, their canopies forming a dense green roof that let in no light. The silence of the forest seemed ominous, as if time itself had slowed down here, leaving us alone with the unknown. Stepping out of the car, we armed ourselves. Neil opened a silver briefcase and took out a device resembling a high-tech detector. Its metallic body gleamed in the dim light, filtering through the thick foliage. "This will come in handy," Neil said, looking at me. We entered the forest, our footsteps echoing in the silence. The forest seemed alive, its shadows shifting as if watching our every move. The surrounding silence was eerie, broken only by the rustling of leaves underfoot and occasional unidentifiable sounds. Each step forward was difficult. The darkness around was impenetrable, and the light from our flashlights seemed to be swallowed by the gloom. The trees looked like grotesque figures, their gnarled branches reaching out towards us as if trying to stop us. Suddenly we heard a strange sound, like a whisper. It seemed to come from the depths of the forest, making us tense up. Neil turned on the device, and it began to emit quiet signals, indicating anomalies nearby. We continued walking, listening carefully to every sound. Passing by an old oak tree, we noticed its roots twitching, as if they were alive. We exchanged uneasy glances and continued on, trying to ignore the oddities around us. Along the way, we encountered oddly twisted trees and unusually large mushrooms, their caps glowing with a faint phosphorescent light. Suddenly, we came upon a clearing bathed in a dim greenish light emanating from strange plants. They looked unnatural. Their leaves veined with purple, and their flowers glowed like tiny stars. "Something's not right here," Neil whispered, examining the anomalous plants. We moved on, feeling fear gripping our movements. The forest seemed like an endless labyrinth filled with secrets and dangers. Suddenly, we heard a rustling in the bushes. Turning around, we saw a figure hiding in the darkness. It moved too quickly to make out. Neil raised his weapon, ready for an attack. We slowly advanced, realizing that the forest was full of unknown threats. At that moment, I felt a chill run down my spine. The forest was alive and clearly did not want us there. We continued through the forest, feeling the darkness thickening around us. Suddenly, I felt a strange, icy sensation, as if someone was watching us. Looking back, I noticed movement among the bushes. "Neil, someone is watching us," I whispered, gripping my gun tighter. We pressed on, trying to move quietly. Soon, small rodents appeared on the path ahead of us. They were albinos, their red eyes gleaming eerily in the dark. They followed us, gradually getting closer. "Look," I pointed at them. "Those are the albino animals." But that was just the beginning. Soon, birds, also albinos, appeared in the sky. Their white wings flashed among the trees, and they began to descend, aiming for us. "We need to get rid of them," Neil shouted, raising his weapon. We started shooting, aiming at the rodents and birds, but there were too many of them. With each shot, it seemed their numbers only increased. They continued to advance, filling the forest with their menacing forms. "We need to run!" I shouted, realizing our situation was becoming critical. We dashed through the forest, trying to escape the swarm of small animals and zombie birds. The rodents climbed up our legs, trying to bite, while the birds dive-bombed us from above. We fought them off as best we could, but they kept coming. "Keep going, don't stop!" Neil yelled, pushing through the dense underbrush. The whole scene felt like a nightmarish horror. The forest seemed endless, and safety was far from us. We ran, stumbling and falling, but each time we got up and kept moving, knowing that stopping meant death. It felt like death itself was chasing us, embodied in these strange and sinister creatures. Our only chance was to keep running without looking back and not giving in to the terrifying threat. Neil, seeing that we couldn't outrun them, pulled out the shiny object from his pocket again and threw it to the ground. It was a paralyzer, a device capable of temporarily immobilizing living creatures. A flash of blinding light spread around, and our pursuers froze in place like statues. "We have a few minutes! Run!" Neil shouted. We bolted further, continuing to move in the direction the hunter had indicated. The forest became stranger and more frightening. We noticed more and more plants with purple veins. Each step brought us more of these unusual plants, their leaves and flowers glowing faintly. How did the locals not notice this? I wondered. Soon we reached the center of this anomaly. Before us stood an enormous purple tree, both majestic and sinister. Its trunk was massive, with deeply grooved bark that seemed almost alive. The tree's branches reached upwards like giant arms covered in glowing purple leaves and star-like flowers. The tree's roots twisted across the ground like enormous tentacles. On some of them grew the same giant vegetables and fruits we had seen at the fair. But here they seemed even more ominous and unnatural. "This is the source of everything," Neil whispered, his eyes fixed on the sinister tree. "This place is the epicenter." We stood in horror, realizing that before us was something that had changed the entire forest and caused all these strange occurrences. The purple tree seemed alive, its leaves rustling as if whispering dark secrets to each other. We began to approach the tree, trying to make no sound. The eerie silence was broken only occasionally by the rustling of leaves. I couldn't take my eyes off this gigantic purple entity, trying to understand what it could be. "Neil, what is this?" I asked, but he just shook his head, indicating he didn't know either. Suddenly we noticed that life was bustling around the tree. Small albino animals like squirrels and rats scurried back and forth. Their behavior was strange and frightening, as if they were under the control of the tree. Albino birds perched on the branches watched us with their eerie red eyes. My mind was racing, trying to find a way to destroy this monstrosity. Suddenly, Neil pointed to the suitcase. Of course, it contained powerful explosives. We needed to get closer to the tree to plant the charge. We moved cautiously, trying not to attract attention. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the tree's roots came to life and began attacking us, writhing and grabbing our legs. Zombie animals also rushed at us, their movements quick and unnatural. "Run!" Neil shouted, firing at the approaching creatures. We dashed forward, trying to get closer to the tree. The roots twisted and grabbed at us, but we fought back, trying to break through the chaos. The zombie animals surrounded us, their lifeless eyes gleaming in the darkness. "Hang on!" I yelled, trying to free myself from the roots coiled around my legs. Neil managed to break free and kept moving forward, pulling me along. We fought off the attackers, but there were more and more of them. Each step towards the tree was a tremendous effort, but we knew we had to keep going. This was our only chance. Finally, we got close enough. Neil opened the suitcase and began setting up the explosives, his hands moving quickly and confidently. I covered him, shooting at the approaching creatures, trying to keep them at bay. "Almost done!" Neil shouted, setting the last charge. The tree's roots came to life again, attacking us with renewed vigor. The zombie animals attacked from all sides, their hateful faces twisted in grimaces. "It's done! Run!" Neil yelled, and we sprinted away from the tree, trying to escape this hell. We ran without looking back, feeling the roots and creatures following us. Adrenaline was pumping in our ears, and I knew that every move could be our last. But we kept running, knowing we had to get to a safe distance before the explosion. We hadn't made it far enough when the explosion went off. A deafening roar shook the entire area, and we were thrown back by the shockwave. I was flung to the side and hit the ground, feeling the world slow down around me. My ears rang and my vision blurred for a moment. Then there was another flash, this time purple, as if a glowing dome covered the entire area. I lay on the ground trying to recover, feeling my body refusing to obey. Gradually, my hearing started to return, and I heard the muffled sounds of the forest. Neil approached me, his face dirty, but his eyes filled with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, kneeling beside me. I tried to respond, but my throat was dry. I nodded, trying to let him know I was okay. Gradually, the ringing in my ears subsided, and I could see my surroundings more clearly. The place where the enormous purple tree had stood was now a large crater. The tree seemed to have evaporated, leaving only emptiness. The purple plants around it instantly withered, their leaves shriveled and fell off. I struggled to my feet, feeling my whole body ache from the fall. Neil helped me, and we walked towards the crater. As we got closer, we saw that the ground around was covered in ash and debris. The silence was almost deafening, as if nature itself was holding its breath after the devastating explosion. The purple flash had left its mark, and everything looked unnaturally empty. Approaching the edge of the crater, I noticed something strange among the debris and ash. It was a piece of concrete wall, broken by the explosion, with rebar sticking out. I pointed it out to Neil. "Look, there's something there," I said, feeling adrenaline surge through my veins again. We carefully climbed down, trying not to slip on the loose soil. As we got closer, I saw a narrow gap in the concrete. I started clearing the rubble with my hands, widening the passage. Neil joined me, and soon we realized that there was some kind of underground structure beneath. We turned on our flashlights and, crawling through the narrow passage, descended inside. we were met by cold, musty air, smelling of dampness and metal. The flashlight beams revealed details. Old metal doors covered in rust, peeling walls, and chipped paint. This was an abandoned underground laboratory. The tile-lined corridors stretched into the distance, disappearing into the darkness. We cautiously moved forward, shining our flashlights ahead of us. Broken signs and plaques hung on the walls, indicating different sections of the lab. We peeked into one of the rooms. Inside were old metal tables covered in a layer of dust, scattered papers, and broken equipment. Diagrams and blueprints related to some scientific experiments hung on the walls. "It looks like they conducted some sort of research here," Neil said, examining one of the plaques covered in incomprehensible symbols. We continued exploring the underground corridors. In one of the rooms, we found broken beakers and test tubes, as well as several computers covered in a thick layer of dust. In the corner stood a massive safe, its door slightly ajar. Inside, we found records and journals describing strange experiments with plants and animals. "This is no ordinary laboratory," I said, flipping through one of the journals. They were clearly conducting experiments related to mutations. In another room, we discovered a large tank filled with a strange liquid, its walls covered in purple veins similar to those we had seen on the plants outside. "It looks like this is the source of the infection," Neil whispered, staring at the tank. We looked around trying to understand how all this was connected to the anomalies and zombies. The laboratory was filled with a grim atmosphere of abandonment and mystery. We carefully examined each room in the lab. The shelves were lined with old books and journals, fragments of scientific equipment, and numerous test tubes with unknown substances. On one of the tables, I noticed a journal covered in a layer of dust. On the cover, in large letters, was written, "The Eye." "Look what I found," I said to Neil, pointing at the journal. I reached out to open it, but suddenly alarms sounded throughout the laboratory. Bright lights filled the corridors and rooms. Devices began powering on one by one. Computers hummed, monitors flickered, and the sounds of ventilation and generators filled the air. "What the hell?" Neil exclaimed, looking around in confusion. We were stunned by what was happening, trying to understand what had triggered the activation of the laboratory. Suddenly, Neil shouted to me, "Come here quickly!" I rushed to him in one of the rooms. It was furnished like a typical laboratory. Metal tables cluttered with scientific equipment and papers, monitors displaying graphs and diagrams, and various flasks with liquids. In the corner of the room stood a massive safe, its door slightly ajar. On the walls were diagrams and charts depicting various stages of mutations and experiments. Behind thick glass cages, we saw a strange creature. It looked like a giant moth the size of a dog. Its wings were covered in dark, almost black patterns, emitting a faint purple glow. The creature's eyes were huge and gleamed with an ominous red light. Its body appeared unnaturally muscular, and its legs were covered in dense hair. "What is that monstrosity?" Neil whispered, not taking his eyes off the creature. I carefully examined the room and noticed several notes scattered on the tables. One of them read, "Experiment X12. The subject exhibits unusual regenerative abilities and aggressive behavior." "It's some kind of experiment," I said, scanning the notes. "They were trying to create something that got out of control." The creature in the cage started moving, flapping its wings and making a low, rumbling sound that sent shivers down my spine. We both knew that this creation was something far more dangerous than anything we had seen before. We stepped out into the corridor, still stunned by our recent discoveries and frightening findings. The laboratory was coming to life, and every step was difficult. Suddenly, a strange creature appeared before us. It looked like a typical werewolf, but was wearing a lab coat. Its appearance was truly horrifying. Tall, muscular, with hairy limbs and long, sharp claws. Its face was twisted in a beastly snarl, and its eyes gleamed yellow like a wild animal. The creature looked at us with surprise, then bared its sharp fangs and leaped at us. I only had time to raise my gun and fire, but it didn't stop it. The werewolf grabbed my shoulder, its claws digging into my flesh, and I felt sharp pain. Neil didn't waste any time. He pulled out a knife and rushed at the werewolf, delivering blows. The creature howled and released me, focusing on Neil. The werewolf was incredibly strong and fast, each of its strikes deadly, but Neil skillfully dodged, continuing to attack. Suddenly, the werewolf made a powerful leap to the corner of the room, where there was a large control panel. With incredible agility, it pressed a big red button. An alarm started throughout the building, and the system's voice announced, "Attention! Countdown activated. Evacuation in 10 minutes." The werewolf, satisfied with its action, snarled again and quickly disappeared into the shadows of the corridor. We didn't even have time to react. "Damn it!" Neil swore, looking at the control panel and the red numbers starting to count down the evacuation time. "We need to get out of here, and fast!" I shouted, trying to overcome the pain in my shoulder. We rushed back down the corridor, trying to remember the way out. Red lights flashed around us, and the alarm sounds echoed through the entire laboratory. We knew we had little time, and every moment was precious. Desperately trying to figure out what to do next, we raced towards the exit, realizing that now not only our lives, but also the unraveling of this sinister mystery depended on whether we could get out in time. When we got outside, instinct took over and we ran. The alarm inside the laboratory indicated that something inevitable was about to happen. We ran without looking back, trying to get as far away as possible. But we hadn't reached a safe distance when an explosion occurred. I was thrown into the air and I lost consciousness. I woke up in the forest. Around me were people in gray protective suits. Cleaners. Their presence reassured me a bit. Neil was lying nearby, and I saw that he was being attended to as well. "Are you all right?" one of the cleaners asked, noticing that I was awake. "Yes, I think so," I replied, trying to understand what had happened. "Did you see the werewolf?" They shook their heads. "No, we didn't find anyone like that," one of them answered. I sighed heavily and thought that the creature had probably escaped. I wondered if we would encounter it again. And what was this organization, the Eye? I pondered these mysteries while lying on the ground and looking at the huge crater left by the explosion. Questions swirled in my head. Why did this laboratory exist? What were its creators' goals? And how were all these horrors connected to the Eye? Neil began to regain consciousness, his face scratched and looking tired. He looked at me, and I knew that we still had a lot of work ahead of us. We could only hope that the next steps would lead us to unravel the secrets left behind by this sinister laboratory. "We need to find out more about the Eye," I said, sitting up and looking at Neil. "Yes," he nodded. "But first, we need to recover from this nightmare." The cleaners continued their work, examining the blast site and collecting evidence. I knew that our work was far from over and that new trials and dangers awaited us ahead.